In around 1136, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote his History of the Kings of Britain, a work that quickly became the medieval equivalent of a bestseller. In his book, Geoffrey gave an extremely fanciful account of the supposed kings of Britain from the end of the Trojan War up until the Welsh had lost the sovereignty of Britain and the Cadwaladr Fendigaid in the 7th century. The authenticity of the work was criticised by some in his own day, but it was largely accepted as authoritative, and its appeal was enduring too, and would influence the direction of romance and pseudo-history for centuries. It was particularly popular amongst descendants of the Britons in Wales, and you can see why, because it gave the Welsh magnificent lineage that stretched back to the Trojan War. Geoffrey's story had Brutus of Troy found in his dynasty on the island, and given it its name. His descendants went on to rule the island, give it laws and order and glory. Most glorious of all was King Arthur, the greatest of all Britons, and it was Geoffrey's history that popularised the figure of Arthur and promoted Geoffrey's vision of him as a European conqueror and paragon of chivalry. But as the centuries wore on, the challenges grew. Geoffrey had notable critics in the Tudor era, first with Polydor Virgil, and then Geoffrey's history was largely usurped in the eyes of most in 1586 when William Camden published the first edition of his chronological description of Britain Island, Britannia. But Geoffrey still had his defenders, who wouldn't take this lying down. They still believed that Geoffrey's story was valid. After all, Geoffrey said that he was only translating his story from a very old book in the British tongue, a claim that is doubted by most today, but if this source could actually be identified, this would give a lot more credibility to Geoffrey's history. So this became quite a divisive issue. Then came the publication of the Myvyrian Archaeology of Wales in 1801, when Welsh manuscript material was widely published for the first time. And as many have noticed, the editors of this published not one, but two Welsh versions of the History of the Kings of Britain. But only one of them did they attribute to Geoffrey of Monmouth, or Griffith ab Arthur they called him, believing that that was an authentic Welsh for his name. And they published a BRUT Griffith ab Arthur, based on Welsh manuscripts of what they saw as Welsh language translations from Geoffrey's Latin work. And the other version that they published was notable for being shorter, with a simpler language, with some interesting additions and omissions from the standard text. A version that the editors didn't attribute to Geoffrey of Monmouth. Instead, they suggested that the author was a 7th century Welsh saint called Tysilio, and audaciously suggested that this document represented Geoffrey of Monmouth's reputed source material, referring to it as BRUT TYSILIO. It was an idea that really took hold at the time, but by now, critical textual analysis by more modern Welsh scholars strongly indicates that the manuscripts referred to as BRUT TYSILIO by the editors of the Myvyrian Archaeology are nothing more than late adaptations of Welsh language translations of Geoffrey's Latin text. So BRUT TYSILIO can only really be lumped in with the other Welsh language translation of Geoffrey's text, a grouping known as BRUT Brenhinedd. And when we say translations, we don't mean literally word for word. It's often a paraphrase with things added and omitted. This is how it was for medieval copyists. And so scholars today group the text into about 6 or 7 categories rather than the 2 that the early antiquarians saw. And all versions of BRUT Brenhinedd have been credibly demonstrated to ultimately derive from a Latin text. But in some popular modern pseudo-historical works, the idea of BRUT TYSILIO as Geoffrey's source is still heralded by some, and you will see a reference by some of these authors to help peddle Geoffrey's history as being more credible, or certain cherry-picked aspects of it at least. What might help is to actually identify where the idea of a British historical chronicle written by Tysilio originally came from. In researching this, I came across something quite unexpected. I'm going to start by telling you about one of the most learned men of Wales in the early to mid part of the 18th century. His name was Lewis Morris, a name that will be familiar to some that saw my recent video with Charles Evans Gunther. I mentioned Lewis as the antiquarian that made the earliest reference to Dinas Mawddwy Camlan location as that of Arthur's final battle, something I've been interested in. Check those videos out. Now Lewis didn't see the history of the kings of Britain as being all authentically true, but he did see an old, authentic Welsh tradition behind it, so he was one of the strongest defenders of Geoffrey of Monmouth. And any Welshman that doubted this, he saw as basically traitors to Wales. And so I'll quote from Lewis now, where he describes his theory on the origin of the history of the kings of Britain. BRUT TYSILIO, which is the title given this book by all our British writers, is said to be wrote by Tysilio, the son of Brochwel Ysgithrog, Prince of Powys. It was first wrote in Latin. It was translated into the language of the Bretons of Armorica, and from thence into the Cambrian or Welsh dialect by Walter Mapeus, or Calenius, Archdeacon of Oxford, from whose copy it was translated into Latin by Galfridus Arthurius about the year 1125. I think it is plain that this history was first wrote in Latin by Tysilio, in which shape Henry of Huntingdon saw it at an ancient library in the Abbey of Bec in Normandy. It was then an old book and entitled De Origine Regium Britannorum, and must have been in Latin, or else Henry of Huntingdon could not have understood that it treated of the affairs of Britain from Brutus de Cadwaladr. It is plain that the Britons of Armorica had translated it out of the Latin into the Breton language, in which last shape Walter, the Archdeacon of Oxford, a Welshman found it in Armorica, who according to Llyfr Coch Hergest translated it out of the Breton into the Cambrian dialect. In that dress it was delivered to Galfrid to be translated into Latin. Galfrid having made several additions to the British copy, which made his translation appear in that age more valuable than the original, because of the credit Galfrid had of being a good historian. This caused Walter again to make a Welsh translation of Galfrid's Latin, so that we have at present some copies in the British tongue of Tysilio, which agree with Galfrid's Latin, and others which are far shorter, and do not contain many things that are found in Galfrid's translation, and those last mentioned past all doubt are the original history of Tysilio. Now guys, some things in there that are not quite right and some things that have been debunked since. Now I'm not going to deal with them in this video, and I'll follow it up with something in the future that will look more closely at the language. But for now, let's stick at looking at why Lewis would attribute this document to Tysilio in particular. Well, the first thing to say is that Lewis and his circle were already enthusiasts for the authenticity and validity of Geoffrey's history, and by attributing the source to a real historical figure, it would give it a great deal in credibility. This kind of makes sense, and Tysilio is still widely considered to be historical. One of the saints of Powys from the 6th or 7th century. There are dedications to him across Wales, particularly centred on Powys, and his main cult site is at Mavod. The Welsh pedigrees give him a royal lineage, the son of Brochwel Ysgithrog, and the brother to Cynan Garwyn. Cynan Garwyn is notable because Llyfr Taliesin has a praise poem dedicated to him, possibly even sang by the great bard Taliesin himself. Tysilio then had a later awdl dedicated to him by Cynddelw. So all in all, a plausible person to have written a grand history that ended in the 7th century. But when did Lewis Morris first seem to have this idea? Well, this becomes clear when we look at some partially surviving correspondence between Lewis Morris and the well-known English historian Thomas Cart. Viewers of this channel may recall this name. I've mentioned him before as a Silurian Arthurist, and if you want to know what that means, go and have a look at my recent interview with Paul Smithy Smith. Okay, so we haven't got the full chain of correspondence between them, but in one letter, written by Morris to Cart, Morris seems to indicate that Cart had previously told him about a British history that had been attributed to Tysilio, and Morris, despite being one of the premier antiquarians of his day, had had no idea before this that such a document had existed. But once he had heard this, there was no going back. The document in question, in Morris's mind at least, could only be Geoffrey of Monmouth's lost, reputed source in the British tongue. And from this he devised his explanation for the origin of the history of the kings of Britain that I gave earlier. So how did Thomas Cart come to hear of this? Well, it turns out that he had borrowed quite a late version of BRUT TYSILIO from the Llanerch Library of the Davis family, a version that Lewis's brother Richard Morris managed to track down. Unfortunately, this version has now been lost, so we only have some extracts that Richard Morris managed to record. Curiously perhaps, it had an English language heading that seemed later than the text of the manuscript, which was in Welsh of course. It seemed to be a 17th century heading based on its orthography, and it said written by Tysilio, son of Brochwel Ysgithrog, Prince of Powys, and translated into Latin by Galfridus Arthurius, Bishop of St. Asaph. And that's it really. There's 2 other known manuscripts to be like it from the extracts. They don't have this heading, and one of these is what was copied into the Myvyrian archaeology, but the ascription to Tysilio was made on the basis of the heading on the lost manuscript that was seen by Richard Morris. But a heading that was clearly a later addition to even that manuscript. So all in all, a pretty weak attribution to that saint. And it seems that even Thomas Carte could see through it. Because in 1747, when Carte published his General History of England, he was very dismissive of Geoffrey of Monmouth and the brute that was attributed to Tysilio. "But I have made no use of his history or romance," said Carte, "it being so manifestly fabulous in the main that there is no depending on his relations, even in points which carry with them an air of probability." And then Carte starts talking about BRUT TYSILIO. Remember that he'd borrowed a copy of this from the library at Llanelch, and this is what Richard Morris saw. The copy of the British original, from whence he pretends to have translated it, is said to be preserved in the library of Jesus College, Oxford. It is much worn, especially on the edges of the leaves, but the hand doth not seem so ancient as the time of Geoffrey. There is another copy thereof in the handwriting, as I am told by those who take upon them to know it well, of the famous poet Gytyn Owen, preserved in the curious library of Mr. Davis in Llanelch in Denbighshire. It is entitled BRUT Brenhinedd, i.e. the history of the kings of Britain, and is ascribed to Tysilio, son of Brochmael Yscythrog, prince of Powys, by a mistaken conjecture founded on a current tradition of this prince's having wrote a history of Britain. For, as the author of the Archaeologia Britannica, who laments the loss of it about 50 years before he wrote, assures us, that work was purely ecclesiastical. Now that's interesting, isn't it? So the historian Thomas Carte believed there had been a mix-up, essentially, and that one of the copies of BRUT Brenhinedd was wrongly attributed to Tysilio, but the real history of Tysilio had been lost, and it was in fact an ecclesiastical history, so a history of the church. Now hardly any of BRUT Brenhinedd can be said to be about the church, so this clearly referring to a different sort of work. They can hardly be the same thing. It was Edward Llwyd that wrote the Archaeologia Britannica in 1707. But his reference to Tysilio's Lost Chronicle doesn't actually make it clear what sort of work it was. That author mentions it kind of in passing when he was talking about another lost book called Llyfr Twrog. Llwyd said, "This book, meaning Llyfr Twrog, whatever it contained is now lost, as is also a chronicle written by Twrog's contemporary, Tysilio, the son of Brochmael Yscythrog, prince of Powys, which I find inserted in H. Salisbury's manuscript catalogue of Welsh writers, and was extant, as I have been credibly informed, within these 50 years. So what was H. Salisbury's manuscript catalogue of Welsh writers? Well, unfortunately, like so many other documents, it's no longer extant, but we know who the H. Salisbury in question was. That's Henry Salisbury, who lived from 1561 to 1637, best known for publishing the Grammar of the Welsh language. So we can assume then that this lost chronicle was still in existence at around 1650. This chronicle is also referred to by Henry Rowlands in Mon Antiqua, written in 1723. He said that Tysilio was one of the sons of the famous Brochmael Yscythrog, who fought the Saxons when a massacre was committed by them on our clergyman, the Bangorish Coed. He is said to have written an ecclesiastical British history, whereof some fragments have been lately seen, but are now lost. His cloister or church was at Llantysilio. And another reference to Tysilio's supposed lost ecclesiastical work is still preserved in a letter from the well-known antiquarian and cultural figure Ieuan Fardd, sent to Lewis Morris in 1764. So Ieuan Fardd told Lewis, in one of Mr. Davis's commonplace books, now in my custody, I find the following curious anecdote, which I shall here transcribe for your sake. April 13th, 80, Mr. M. Lloyd told me that Bishop Usher said that when he was a young man, he had seen an old book called Ecclesiae Britannicae Historiae Auctore, Tysilio Filio Brochmaeli, Regis Powysei. This book was then in the hands of Dr. Price, prebend of Westminster, and Mr. Lloyd, upon inquiry, found Dr. Lewis of St. Cross had it afterwards, but being asked concerning it, said he lost it by burying it in the wartime, but Mr. Lloyd thinks that he sent it to Rome, having since heard he was turned papist. So there we are, maybe it's in Rome, but I don't think it's turned up to this day. The M. Lloyd mentioned here is Meredydd Lloyd, by the way, who was a collector of manuscripts from Welshpool, and the Bishop Usher mentioned is very well known, the author of Britannicarum Ecclesiarum Antiquitates, the early history of the British Church. If the anecdote is true, he would have seen it at around 1600, and the Mr. Price, prebend of Westminster, who supposedly lost it, would have been Dr. Theodore Price, who lived from around 1570 to 1631. But unfortunately, Bishop Usher didn't seem to mention it in his history at all, which leaves us questioning the authenticity of all these statements. The Mr. Davis, whose book this anecdote came from, was the antiquarian Robert Davis, who who established the Llanerch Library in the first place and lived from 1658 to 1710. He was the grandfather of the Robert Davis that borrowed the copy of the Brut that seems to have been ascribed to Tysilio to Thomas Cart. But confusingly, Ieuan Fardd also recorded another anecdote on the nature of Tysilio's supposed chronicle. In his essay, A Short View on the State of Britain, he says, "Who was the author of Brut y Brenhinoedd is not known. Some have ascribed it to Saint Tysilio, the son of Brochwel Ysgythrog, the patron saint of Meifod in Montgomeryshire, but without any foundation. For in an account of manuscripts written by Thomas Williams, M.D., about the year 1600, I found this account of the genuine work of Tysilio," and he quotes, "Dr. Dee conveyed a book composed by Tysilio Sant into England. At the time he obtained a commission to survey Wales for history." So that's another well-known Thomas Williams antiquarian who died in 1623. And Dr. Dee, Dr. John Dee that is a very interesting character, close to the English monarchy. There seems to be a belief that he was the one that took Tysilio's manuscript into England. For its precise nature, we don't know. Was it a copy of a Brut that was seen by Richard Morris? Or was it an ecclesiastical history, as it seems to be believed by Ieuan Fardd? So this will remain a mystery. The second-hand testimonies of Bishop Ussher, Henry Salisbury and Thomas Williams that were witnesses at the end of the 15th century and the early 16th century to the existence, to a chronicle of Tysilio.